Okay, it looks like we are about ready to begin. So again, let me begin by welcoming you all this afternoon. Again, it is a gorgeous day here in Ann Arbor, so I appreciate you taking the time to come join us and to talk about the Holocaust a little bit. My name is Jeffrey Weidlinger, and I'm the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan. And it's a great pleasure today to introduce Mark Roseman, who is speaking as part of the Frankel Center's Holocaust Remembrance Week in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, which falls this coming Wednesday. In addition to today's talk, the Frankel Center is also co-sponsoring a talk on Wednesday at 6 by Amy Simon, who is the Farber Family Chair in Holocaust Studies at Michigan State University, and incidentally, was also one of Professor Roseman's students. Today's speaker, Mark Roseman, is Pat Glaser Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at Indiana University. He's the author of, among others, the Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution, Jewish Responses to Persecution, A Past in Hiding, and most recently, Lives Reclaimed. I have had the great pleasure of knowing Mark for about 17 years, during which I had the privilege of working with him at Indiana University for almost a decade, where I was once also a professor. Mark is not only a brilliant scholar, profound thinker, and enthralling speaker, but he is also a generous soul and talented teacher and mentor. Before I got to know Professor Roseman as an individual, though, I was enraptured by his scholarship. His book, The Past in Hiding, has rightly been called a heart-stopping survivor story. The book explores the life of Mariana Strauss, an ordinary Jewish woman who led an extraordinary life and managed to survive the war in hiding. It's a remarkable story that Roseman uncovers with shrewdness and sensitivity. He explores not only her story of survival through documents and oral history, but also the nature of memory and the varied ways in which personal memory intersects with the historian's craft. Professor Roseman returned to Marianne's story years later with his most recent book, Lives Reclaimed, which draws our attention to the Bund, the scouting organization that sheltered Strauss. Through a collective biography of the ordinary folks who established lasting friendships in the Bund, Roseman shows how quotidian acts of kindness and small gestures provided respite to the oppressed. But this is not the type of idealistic resistance that's often lionized by Yad Vashem's righteous Gentiles, but rather a much more complex type of collective support network that Roseman shows could sometimes really make a difference. The book is a gripping and fascinating study of the human condition under its most trying circumstances, and it is the subject of Professor Roseman's talk today. Throughout his talk, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. The chat is disabled, but if you have a question, please do pose it through the Q&A function. After Professor Roseman's talks, which should last about 40 minutes or so, 30 minutes to 40 minutes, I will return to the screen to moderate any questions, and you can also feel free to pose questions through the Q&A at that point. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Roseman to the University of Michigan virtually. Professor Roseman.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be there. I'm just sorry that I couldn't actually be physically present and enjoy that warm weather and warm company, but I do want to thank Kelsey Robinette-Keeves for the really wonderful organization. It's just incredibly professionally done and a great pleasure to be part of this efficient machine. I'm going to share my screen because I'd like to show some slides and some images. So I hope that works. So let me just do that. So Jeff, you will let me know if you can't see my screen, but I'm hoping that that's
all good. We can see it.
Okay, great. As Jeff said, I want to draw on the work from my recent book, and I want to talk about this rather remarkable, rather quirky group, the League for Socialist Life. They call themselves the Bund, nothing to do with the famous Bund that we know from East European Jewish history. Uh, a group that, as again Jeff said, I first encountered when I was writing the history of a survivor who had a remarkable trajectory of surviving in Germany. And I got to meet some members of the Bund. They were not alive now, unfortunately, but there were some still alive when I was beginning my research quite a few years ago. And so my initial sort of purpose with this book was to introduce what felt to me like a rather remarkable group of people, try and work out what they'd done and why they'd done it, and also to understand why it was that they hadn't received any recognition after the war. As I got to sort of delve deeper into the group, I also realized that alongside a remarkable record, they also had some remarkable records. And in fact, I would venture to say that this is one of the best documented groups that engaged in rescue in Nazi Germany, or indeed under Nazi rule, that ever existed. I discovered the suicide note, or fake suicide note, of one of the women whom the group protected, that she left behind and was found in order to provide an alibi to the Gestapo. I found the Gestapo records that recorded the moment in which Marianne Strauss, whom Jeff already mentioned, escaped from her house in 1943, unfortunately having to leave her family behind, then to be protected by the Bund for almost 2 years. I found the diary of Arthur Jacobs, the sort of guru of the group, who here recording in his notes the moment in which he learned that Marianne had managed to escape and was at that point staying with another Bund member, and he was talking about her qualities. This is what he was saying: Marianne in the log cabin, this was a wooden building that belonged to the group, so his notes about her personality and what a figure she was. And the existence of this truly unique body of materials changed the project somewhat and enabled me to think not just about what a splendid group this was, and to ask how their solidarity had worked and how they'd escaped detection, but also I came to realize that there was another story which reached well beyond the group, and that was that there was a real difference in places between the picture of their activities that emerged from the contemporary records, from the records that were drawn up, the diaries, the Gestapo reports, and so on, during the war, and the way that people remembered and described it afterwards. And I came to believe, and I'll return to this towards the end, that in fact, the way that we talk about rescue is really very largely the rescue of memory. And it's only now, in fact, in the last few years, I think that historians are beginning to think about the difference and trying to write the rescue of history. And I'll come back to that a little bit towards the later on in the lecture. So what I want to do with this talk is just explore sort of around this documentation, 5 or 6, depending on the time, key themes that emerge from the book. So just a few words about the group. They were based in the Ruhr region in the west of Germany, an industrial region. That they were based in Essen and further south in Wuppertal and in Düsseldorf and in Mülheim. They had groups all spread around the Ruhr. They were a bunch of, this is from the 20s, they were young people largely in their 20s. Arthur Jacobs, their guru, was 20 years older, largely working class, but with some teachers and other middle class members, largely Protestant, but with a few Catholics and also some Jewish members. They got to know each other through classes in adult education courses. They were very much bent on self-improvement. They were strongly left-wing, but they also wanted to combine Kant's ethical imperative and Kant's ethical thinking with socialism. A number of groups tried to do this in Germany. They were very holistic in their approach. They ate together. They also had some collective housing. They spent weekends together in exercises and so on. Their project was to create a kind of a utopian community, but one in the middle of the industrial area. And they hoped to spread the message to create the basis for a better society. A slightly quirky group in some ways, non-conformist, tightly bonded, but in no way prepared for a Nazi dictatorship, and not a group that one would have expected that would have survived the brunt of persecution and assault after 1933. So part of my question was how did they do so? There's Arthur Jacobs. Picture from the 20s. I say he was 20 years older. He had been a grammar school teacher and had become committed to the adult education scene and was the really driving force behind this group. He was married to Dora, who, as we'll see in a moment, brought something rather different to the group, namely new forms of physical education. So that's just a little bit background to the unlikely group that turned out to be able to weather the storm, survive the Nazi era, and save up to 8 lives, I think, and do a lot more also, as well as saving lives. So the first thing that I'd like to pick up on is this theme of the secrets of solidarity. I mean, one of the things that they do from the beginning is they rethink carefully everything about their operation. In other words, what do they need to do to escape detection? And you can see this letter. Now, this letter, in fact, was intercepted by the Gestapo, which is one reason why it's been preserved, because it was in the Gestapo archives. But it's a letter that's carefully creating the impression that here's just a sort of family of friends get together, but in fact, it's trying to ensure that everyone turns up at the right moment for a meeting, doesn't arrive too early, doesn't arrive too late, so there's no visible large group outside the door and so on. Of more interest to me, however, was the way in which what had been their sort of lifestyle before 1933 turned out to have a sort of secret strength, creating cohesion and camouflage under Nazi rule. When I interviewed one of the surviving members of the group who'd come into it through her interest in physical movement, in body training, which she'd done with Dora Jacobs, Arthur's wife, she tried to explain to me that she'd come to the group because of this interest in physical training. And there was something about the training that meant that she realized that she had to commit to the group with body and soul. And I must say, I couldn't understand a word of it. It sounded all very laudable, but I couldn't see the connection. And it took a long time for me to register the ways in which daily practices, the physical grounding, the communal experience of moving together and bodies together, the fact that Jews and Gentiles were exercising together, and also the camouflage that it gave the group if they had materials related to physical movement and dance, or a couple of times when there were house searches and the Gestapo couldn't quite make sense of the papers that they were finding. Although I should say that some groups did end up for short periods in concentration camp. It gradually dawned on me that there was something about this taking everyday life seriously, this physicality, this treating the personal and the political, that created a set of bonds that proved remarkably durable under Nazi rule. And this is an image from a so-called movement choir, a sort of kind of dance theater that the group would do. And one of the experiences that one of the surviving members remembered that was very powerful was that they crossed over early in the 30s, when the Nazis were already in power, crossed over the border into Holland and did a performance of a sort of very political piece together. And this experience of, in a way, enacting their experiences to an audience oversee it. And here's a picture of an outing during the 1930s. Again, not completely risk-free, but they would go to the Sauerland, the beautiful moorland not far from the Ruhr, separately, and then meet up there. So there was something about the way in which they'd managed to transform these everyday activities into something that created a sense of bonding, of grounding, and of solidarity. A second theme that I'd like to raise with the heading Flowers for the Jews, I want to take one particular episode and say, I think there was a category of action here that we haven't thought enough about when we talk about rescue of Jews. It involves a woman called Tove Gerson, who was married to a half-Jewish man by a Nazi definition. He had worked for his company, and they recognized it was proving very difficult to keep him on, but sort of showed a great deal of solidarity. So got him, helped to get him to get a job in the US, and he was working in the oil industry in Oklahoma. She joined him later, and in her records, which are preserved, she gives you can find a speech that she gave in 1942, trying to wake up her audience at the first Christian church in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, as to what this war was about and what had been going on in Nazi Germany. And she describes an experience in the night after Kristallnacht, when she went to visit a wealthy Jewish couple, the Heinemanns in Essen, now retired, whom she got to know through her parents-in-law. They used to have chamber concerts in their rather splendid house, and she'd go there and listen to the concerts. And she decided that she wanted to go and show solidarity after the destruction of Kristallnacht. So she turns up outside the house, and there's a bit of a mob milling around because the wealthy Heinemanns were sort of figures that that were sort of targets. She had a bunch of flowers. She works her way through the mob. Somebody comes up to angrily and says, and you're bringing flowers to the Jews. She mumbles something. The front door is so smashed in you can't get in. She goes in through the tradesman's entrance in the side and goes in, and she finds the house utterly shattered, and the couple sitting there, and obviously also absolutely shattered. She sort of spends a bit of time with them. She leaves them, and then she's involved in other activities. For example, she goes with other members of the group to a Jewish orphanage in Dinslaken, which has also been really ransacked. And she decides to go back and see if the Heinemanns have some able to offer some financial support to help to get the orphanage back on its feet. In fact, it never does, and finds that the couple have committed suicide. And I was thinking that carrying flowers doesn't obviously rank that high when we're thinking about lives rescued. It doesn't seem like a very big gesture. And yet the courage that it took to brave the mob and go there was a courage that actually very few people found. I mean, the Heinemanns were on good terms with their neighbors, but they were a former civil servant, but they were so nervous, they didn't stick their noses out. They were only looking through the window and didn't venture any solidarity. It was no small gesture. And those moments of connection, we know from Victor Klemperer how important that they were. And I feel that in some ways our emphasis on rescue has blinded us a little to the importance of help and solidarity. And this moment of bringing flowers to the Jews seemed to me a rather important one. And of course, it was also one which gave you confidence that you could do it, you could survive it, and could be a threshold action for more, as it was for Tove before she left Germany to join her husband. Incidentally, she continued to have a sort of remarkable life and was active in the civil rights movement in the US in the 50s and the 60s. My next theme is the weight of a parcel, and I'm thinking particularly of the spiritual weight of a parcel. From 1939, when Jews were deported from the Posen area into Poland, all the way through to 1944, the Bund kept up a remarkable program of sending small parcels to deported Jews with whom they were able to make some connection. In this case, the correspondence that I want to refer to is one with a woman called Trude Brandt, who had a connection with members of the Duisburg Jewish community. One of the Bund members reached out to them to see what they could do to help, and they established the connection. And all the way through until 1943 or 42, I think actually the last letter that they are able to send out is 41, 42. Trude Brandt, I think, is murdered in 43, at least the trace ends in 43. But all the way through, the Bund is able to send parcels and letters or cards hidden in the parcels. And for a considerable period, Trude Brandt was able to acknowledge the importance of those parcels. And so she sends a rather sort of witty note acknowledging the potatoes that were underwear in a previous life, because there she was sort of with the community from Posen dumped in this brutal conditions in the occupied part of Poland, the general government, and would trade with the locals the goods that the Bund would send in order for foodstuffs, and therefore she would eat bread that she's baked from a woolen jacket or potatoes that were once underwear. But I think the thing that I wanted to stress was how important for her, quite apart from the material value of the trading value of the things, or actually the direct value of clothing that they sent, was the spiritual value of their connection. And she writes once, and so it's so isolated, it's important that new strength flows in from somewhere. In fact, it's essential for survival. To feel the warmth and proximity of people so similar to myself, it's like having a transfusion after losing a lot of blood. It is life-saving. This is not just an analogy or a phrase, it's the purest truth. And do sense what you're giving me. And several times we hear this. And the Bund, in fact, I think one of the things that was really striking was that they were very conscious that they didn't want to create the dependency of charity, even though, of course, the situation was so unequal. And so they were always trying to find ways in which they could establish some sense in which the person they was helping was really helping them. So, for example, Lisa Jacob, another member of the group, writes that there are members of the group who have small children who are having some difficulty bringing their children. She knew that Trude Brandt had 4 children. Could she give some advice on child rearing? And Trude writes this, she's just blown away by the thought that she actually has something to give in her position. It was something the Bund was very committed on. And just one other example of this. This is a letter sent in October 1945 from a woman, Isa Hermans, who'd been she was Jewish, a doctor in Düsseldorf, with whom another Bund member, Elsa Bramesfeld, had made contact. Isa Hermans was in Theresienstadt, and Theresienstadt, the ghetto, was the last place that was still able to receive parcels and letters. And by the way, one has to think for a moment that, you know, it's astonishing, first of all, that the German post was still delivering these parcels and letters right up to 1944, but also the kind of courage that it took to go there and show that you were showing solidarity with this group that you weren't supposed to show solidarity. I mean, the whole transaction is amazing, but it happened. Evidently Elsa had managed, and others, because Ilse Hermans refers to several different people who'd sent, had managed to send parcels all the way through the war, and she just tries to get over the significance of it. You must hear it from me again and again. Allow me to tell you again and again that these parcels from outside gave me the will to survive, gave something so horribly meaningless, some meaning, somehow held me steady. In short, they helped immeasurably. And she says, yes, we were hungry, we were starving, the foodstuffs that you sent were very important, but this was this spiritual lifeline, this recognition that somebody still remembered you, recognized your humanity, maintained that connection, was was all important. And again, I think because we understandably, given the risks to life, are so focused on material health and saving life, we perhaps haven't quite measured the value of solidarity. But these letters, I think, reveal it. This next example is rather different. In some ways, it's idiosyncratic, but in other ways, I think it's revealing of something larger. And it takes us back to the weeks and months after Kristallnacht. This is the point at which the Bund really gets active. I've already talked about when Tove Gerson brings flowers, but Arthur had really initiated this. Arthur Jacobs had initiated this. He said it's time to break through our reserve and show solidarity. And all sorts of different group members reach out to different people in the community with whom they have some kind of connection, show solidarity and ask what help they can give and so on. And one of the remarkable, I keep using that word, but it's kind of, when it comes to the Bund's documentation, it's sort of inexhaustible word. Another sort of part of their documentation is that Arthur and Dora had a son who was by Nazi definition mixed race, since Arthur was not Jewish and Dora was Jewish, and had found life very difficult. He was born in 1918, so he's 20 in 1938, and so the Arthur and Dora arranged for him to go to Holland to stay with relatives and see if he can't live a sort of slightly freer life there. Of course, soon he finds himself under German occupation and life is not at all free, but he survives. And incredibly, the letters that they sent to him survive. And so all the way through from 1938 to 1944, we have the letters that they send to their son, Friedel. And in January 1939, Arthur sends a letter to Arthur describing, I mean, he's very oblique. He doesn't mention the Bund. He's sort of for friends and so on. But he's giving Friedel a sense of what they've been doing to assist members of the Jewish community who've been absolutely hit by Kristallnacht, and then the onslaught of legislation that followed, and the huge tax on Jews that followed, and so on. And he writes, Arthur writes to Friedel, and if anything in these dark times can revive our belief in the sparks of spiritual strength within us, it is these small moments of experience when one sees that words land on fertile soil. People learn to see their lives from a completely different perspective. Under the hammer blows of fate, the old tired approach of seeking simply a pleasurable life, a good position, riches, security, and affluence suddenly turns into nothing, dissolves, and gives way to other goals. And what's striking for me about this is, at this stage, obviously the Nazis had not yet resolved on murder as their solution to the Jewish problem. And for the Bund, which were in fact, very critical of bourgeois life and of the very middle-class Jewish community, they saw this, the help and this experience, as a moment to assist those who, if you like, had been stuck in a sort of bourgeois way of viewing the world, to break free of that and to embrace a new, less materialistic, more spiritual way of viewing life and the meaning of life. And that was their satisfaction in acting. It's very striking. And when hears this again, and even in one of Tove's speeches in 1942, you can hear a last echo of this. And I raise this not because this was their only reason for acting, or that it necessarily was a universal reason why people help Jews. Neither of those is true. But what I find so striking about this is a note, this is a voice that after the war you do not hear. After the war, once it was clear what the Holocaust would come to entail, once it was clear that the program was seeking the destruction of all life, the idea that you could act and help people to feel more free of their materialism, that you could achieve a sort of social transformation in miniature and help these bourgeois selves see a better life. I mean, that was simply unthinkable. It was unsayable. And for me, that's just a small example of the way in which the contemporary vantage point, this contemporary moment voice, unearthed something which by the time you get to the end of the war, when the knowledge of what has happened, or what will happen, has become so overwhelming, is no longer sayable. And I do think that one of the things that this project for me really did expose was this difference between the experience of acting in the moment and the perspective looking back when so much more was known, but also no longer in the thick of things and with time to reflect. In some ways, the time to reflect was an advantage, but in other ways, it shifts the perspective. And I think I'll just have one more example, and then I will stop to allow time for questioning, or maybe if there's time, just two more examples. This phrase "remembering for the future," of course, is a familiar one from Holocaust remembrance, coined decades after the war. But that's not what I want to talk about here. I want to point to something which is, again, which sort of follows on from what I just said. Immediately after the group was liberated, or at least the core members of the group had managed to find a refuge in the last days of the war, because one of the members, luckily for them, owned a small guest house on the shores of Lake Constance, and although horribly overcrowded and they were rather getting on each other's nerves, they survived, including Dora, who at this point is also, as a Jewess, is under target because the protections for mixed marriages have fallen through. They survive in this guest house, overcrowded guest house, and as soon as they're liberated, the French troops come through on April 29th, and on a couple of days later, on May the 1st, Labor Day, Artaud gives a speech, and this speech is recorded. And in that speech, he has a first go at laying down what it is that they've done. So, I mean, it's just remarkable. Now I'm saying it again, but it is incredible that, here again, 48 hours after they've liberated, we have a text of how he presents their past. And much of what he would say there sets the sort of the terms of the group's later remembering, and this is a report they produced in '46 about their help that they offered Jews, the report on the aid that they offered, and here's a report from '47, the report on the illegal work of the group. And in fact, those were the first documents that I had about the group. So when I first was working on them, they were sort of the basis for what I thought about the group. And it took a long time for me to realize that although there was much to learn from these, they were also already rather different in other ways from the picture that emerged from their wartime records. And that was because at this point already, the group was really hoping to set itself up as an influential group for a sort of moral revival of post-war Germany. They wanted to stake their claim to be post-war leaders for a society that had lost its way. And so the way that they describe their wartime experience, their experience under Nazism, is already harnessed to telling a particular kind of story to convince others that they have the answers and that they are ready to lead. And I'll just give one example of this, which I found fascinating. From the group's wartime records, the diaries, the letters, the reports, and so on, it's clear that the biggest impact force that's impacting on those who are on the home front, and indeed those who are conscripted, is the war itself. The massive impact of the bombing war on the Ruhr, the disruption, the threat to life, these were utterly central experiences for the group. And in fact, they transformed the group's sense, I think, of their own power. In Weimar, they'd always imagined themselves as a vanguard that could help to transform society. When they realized how powerless they were compared with the titanic forces waging this war, they came to see their role, I think, in a much more sort of diminished way, despite the fact that they achieved what they achieved. And it's very clear from Arto's diaries how significant this war experience is. In Arto's speech, giving just 2 days after they had an earth-changing, life-shattering experience of almost being caught up in fighting between the French and the Waffen-SS, 2 days afterwards, in his report and in these, the war disappears. It's all about the group and Nazis. And I think that's because the experience of contending with war didn't fit into the moral story that they want to tell. Now, that doesn't mean that the story they're telling is wrong or that they're making stuff up, but it means that the vantage point of wanting to communicate with the post-war world and wanting to distinguish what they felt was important about what they'd done, meant that what actually had been a decisive element of their experience during the war has, within 48 hours, completely disappeared off the page. And there are other aspects of it too, but this, I think, was a very striking example of the difference between looking at the group from the vantage point of its experience and looking at it from the vantage point. And I'm not even sure if memory is the right word, because it's not because anything has been forgotten, but it's about how different it is to look back when you have an eye to your contemporary world and to the to the future. So the last aspect of the book, and the last thing that I just touched on, is rather sad experience for the group was that they didn't come to be they didn't come to resonate. They didn't find a new following. They became a sort of aging group of friends that sticks together. And they also don't get recognition. They don't get recognized as resistors when in the 1960s, a younger generation of Germans starts recovering the left-wing resistance against the Nazis. They're not taken seriously because they weren't putting placards up, and they weren't they were simply helping and saving lives. And they don't get recognized during their lifetimes by Yad Vashem because they don't, as Jeff mentioned at the very beginning, they don't quite look like the individual rescue. And I was struck by, this is a recent book about rescue produced by the former director of the righteous section of Yad Vashem. And he titles the book "Individuals versus the System." Well, this is a characterization the Bund would absolutely have rejected. It's not about individuals against the system. It's about how an informal network that in some ways was camouflaged and invisible, and in other ways tied together by bonds of steel, was able to mobilize the strengths of a group to reach out and take small gestures seriously to help others and save lives. And it was only after the Past in Hiding came out, the book about Marianne Strauss, that I was able to persuade Yad Vashem to act. But even then, some members are recognized as individuals, others were not recognized, and the group as such is not really recognized. So that in that way, what had happened is being slightly distorted. Again, it's the rescue of memory against the actual experience of acting as a network, and it's that hidden story that I've tried to recover.
Thank you, Mark, for that really remarkable talk that you're able to give us about what is really a remarkable book. So there are some questions that have come through on the Q&A, and I want to say for others, if you would like to ask a question, you can actually either put it on the Q&A or you can click the raise hand, and I can actually call on you, and there's a little button where I can allow you to talk, to ask a question. So if you have questions, again, you can either type them in the Q&A or press raise hand, and I can press this button that will allow you to talk. If you do choose to talk, remember, I can depress the button and take away that, allowing you to talk if we go on too long, but do feel free to use that option as well. So let me begin, before I turn to the Q&A, by asking you my own question, which is, I wonder if you can just reflect a little bit more on or really let us know a little bit more about the ideological roots of the movement, which you write about a bit in the book, but where, what's the Bund's defining ideology that gets them together? Are they just a sporting organization, a scouting organization, or what more, what's the ideological underpinnings to the group as a whole?
No, they're not sporting or scouting. I guess they draw on three different sort of strands, movements, all of which, I mean, they're the most Weimar of groups, I would say, because they really do embody so many kinds of movement of Weimar Germany. One is obviously the labor movement, and this trend to try and combine a sort of ethical imperative with labor. We know that from Austro-Marxism. There are various groups in Germany. That there's a somewhat more famous group called the Nelson Bund, which has a similar kind of ideology. So one of it is about trying to add this kind of ethical choice element, or recognizing ethical necessity, in fact, to Marxist thinking. I think ultimately, there's a certain theoretical coherence ultimately, but it didn't matter at the practical level of making it work. So that was one strand of it. A second is the youth movement. There was this sort of style of the so-called Bundish Youth, these young people who get together and who see themselves as a kind of alternative to what they see as the sort of corrupt lifestyle or the materialistic lifestyle of the adult world, and teens and young 20s, and so they very much have and they call themselves a Bund. There are so many different Bunds in that way, and those groups usually had a guru who was 20 years older as a leader, but otherwise young people together, and that sense of creating their own family, and that overriding the loyalties to their actual biological family. So they bring that element to it, and then there's this movement of life reform since the late 19th century, of trying to what was seen as recover authentic relation to the body, to aesthetics, and so on, from the depredations of industrial life. Dora had been very much influenced by the Eurythmics movement, and had been at the center of Hellerau, where there's sort of a wonderful place of sort of innovation just before the First World War. And she developed her own technique of body training. So there was this life reform, there was this youth movement, and there was this socialism and Kantian element, which they fused together. But in many ways, they feel just like, countless groups on the left-wing scene. It's just that not so many succeed in carrying themselves through the Nazi period with such honor.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so let me turn to one of the questions that's been posed, which is from our very own Hank Greenspan, who certainly knows a lot about testimony and memory of the Holocaust as well. And Hank says, "Hi, Mark, interesting as always. As you'll know, many survivors refer to the significance of small acts of solidarity of the kind that you've described. Also essential in most political organizing. Do you think work like yours is part of a wider tendency to use close specifics to see better what we've taken as general?" I think of Wendy Lauer's book. I presume he's referring to her recent book about the photograph of the ravine. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hank, and very nice to hear from you. Yes, absolutely. I agree, but I think if I would see it that I'm actually part of of a edited volume, which has I think it has the title "The Rescue Turn," or at least maybe that's not the title, but they're talking about the rescue turn. And I think it's sort of been quite surprising how long it took for historians to actually try to uncover rescue as a history, rather than the sort of commemorative practices or psychologists and ethicists talking to rescuers decades after the event, but actually trying to go back and recover the daily experiences and practices. So yes, it's using the small to think larger, but I think it's also this trying to historicize a rescue, as I say, to tell the rescue of history, and not just the rescue of memory. And I mean, it's not to say that everything that people say decades after the event is wrong, obviously, and as you have done so much interviewing, you know that would be anathema. But what I think does shift, even though people may remember details with such vividness, because these are moments of such life and death moments, I think what does shift is the sort of interpretative framework, the vantage point, and that can change the meaning of the experience, and that really is what I've tried to bring out.
That's interesting, and in fact, that's I think what a lot of trauma studies say as well. If we look at this whole genre of trauma studies, is that the root of the experience is consistent but changes perspective in time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let me turn to the next question we have from David Brenner. Asks, so how inevitable is this heroization of the individual, that is the rescuers? And on the topic of the rescuers, how problematic is the altruistic personality approach, if that's not too direct of a query, he asks.
Thanks so much, David. I mean, I think heroization is inevitable. We always seek individuals, and I was drawn by the quality of the individuals I met. So I think that sense is inevitable. On the other hand, there was a discussion in Yad Vashem in Israel in the immediate post-war period about what shape commemoration of rescuers should be, and on the left there had been a move to have a more collective recognition of groups and nations, and in the end it was the individual model, also drawing on this notion of the righteous among the nations. There's also a religious notion that dominates, but it didn't absolutely need to have done. So in that sense, I think Yad Vashem's model was extremely influential, and it also shaped the way in which then scholars approached it, because very often they would take those who'd been recognized by Yad Vashem as rescuers, the subjects of their study, since they were then safe that they had bona fide rescuers whom they could then interview. So in that way, on one level, we always seek individuals to heroize. On another level, there is a very specific history here. The altruistic personality, I mean, there are different versions of these psychological efforts. I think the problem with them is there's clearly no doubt that there are astonishing acts of altruism, and there's no question about that. But when you look in the German context, where networks, informal networks, so often at least play some kind of a role, you realize that the dynamics between individuals, the connections between them, may just be as important as any individual's particular personality. I mean, one of the things that I talked about what the group didn't talk about in their recognition after the war. And one of the things I think is absolutely central about this group is that the leading figure was a Gentile married to a Jew, and so often the mixed marriages play an important role in rescue, because they enable connection. They create connections between the Gentile and the Jewish worlds. The Gentile world is then woken up as to what's going on for the Jews, and the Jews have connections with people who are not themselves endangered. Mixed marriages and converts also play an important role in rescue in Holland, for example. That has nothing to do with the altruistic personalities. I think what happened was the insights into the psychology were very valuable when they were first introduced, but then they took over and we kind of lost sight of the whole environmental history, the group history. And the other side of it, of course, and this applies less to the Bund, is we also conflated rescue with moral uprightness, whereas in fact we know that a great deal of rescue takes place in exchange for money, in exchange for goods, in exchange for promises, in exchange for sex, in exchange for all sorts of things, and there's not much altruism there, although it did end up with people surviving.
That's an interesting point, of course. Let's go to Shachar Pinsker has a question here. How is the group remembered and understood in Germany, he asks? And is it different from the ways in which Yad Vashem or other Jewish institutions understand and remember them?
Hi, Shachar. Nice to hear your written voice, as narrated by Jeff. I would say that what happened in Germany was, I mean, there was very little recognition. So there's a series of different moments in the history of remembering rescue in Germany, and each of which looks different. There's a very early post-war phase in which an awful lot of people like to say that they'd help Jews in order to help them get through denazification. And then there's a period in which nobody wants to remember rescue because it might imply that they'd known something and could have done something, and they knew nothing and could have done nothing anyway. And then there's a phase in which in Berlin, and specifically in Berlin, there's a program for recognizing, which is less individual than Yad Vashem and doesn't have quite this notion of the righteous, but has some similarities. And then there are sort of piecemeal moments of recognition, which often tend to be individually based. And then from the late 70s into the 80s, I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's the writer of the book I Wore the Yellow Star, sort of a German woman who'd survived living underground. Then there's a new awareness, but the awareness by now is very much influenced by Yad Vashem. So Yad Vashem's model then I think also shapes the way people think about it in Germany. So in that sense, I think the notion of the righteous is influential. As far as the scholarship goes, although I said that historians have been slow to actually write the history of rescue, there were some historians in Germany, and Wolfgang Benz was probably the most important in leading a team on this, and they wrote a 5-volume history called Help and Solidarity. And I think the reason that they spotted that rescue wasn't necessarily the right concept and that one should be looking at a broader palette of actions and gestures was, of course, that there was assistance given in Germany for an extended, by small numbers, for an extended period before we enter the era of murder, which is not like many of the countries that the Nazis encounter. And in that sense, the German experience revealed to those few historians who really engaged to it that one should be thinking about different ways of establishing connections well before one was actually talking about rescue from being killed. And that was, I think, an important early angle in some German historiography, and that was distinctive. And now I think it's becoming, as I was saying in my answer to Hank, it's becoming a more universal aspect of the way at least historians write, and of course that then begins to influence public memory too.
It's interesting. Another question from Rachel Levy this time. She writes, the Holocaust has played a hugely influential role in contemporary American Jewish discussions around Jewish continuity. However, as we move further away from World War II and lack the voices to speak on its direct behalf, its centrality has been shifted. How do you think the Holocaust will continue to shape Jewish conversations on continuity as our memories and the holders of those memories fade?
Yeah, that's one of those wonderful questions. And I think I have 3 minutes left
Big
to answer. No, Rachel, no, it's a fantastic question, and actually it's one I'm going to have to be thinking about, because I'm writing something that sort of thinks about the role of catastrophe in Jewish life, and as you all know as well as I do, it's sort of very much contested of whether or not the Holocaust has had a distorting effect in terms of Jewish identity, has claimed too much ground, and has blinded Jews to the kinds of challenges that constitute their everyday, or has come to displace the spiritual or other dimensions of Jewish life, or has created a too muscularly defensive Jewish community, and a politics of overly emphasized on solidarity with Israel, and not inclusive enough, and so on and so on and so forth. And these are in part ethical questions, questions about predicting the future, which historians are notoriously bad at, and the sort of questions also about your your relationship to Jewish life. So I think it would be foolhardy of me to commit myself. But I mean, I'll just say from my own sort of ethical point of view, I think if for reasons that go beyond anything that I could directly articulate, I would feel it a huge loss if we cease to remember the experience of the Holocaust, but I think it needs to be always rethought and reintegrated in a relationship of different experiences. And I'm so pleased that Jeff's book is coming out later this year about the violence against Jews in the early post-World War I period, which was so important in prefiguring, creating new kind of patterns of anti-Jewish violence, but also new patterns of thinking about and recording that violence, which of course were very influential in the way in which Jews chronicled and thought about the Holocaust. So that's one dimension of integration I think for a long time we neglected, and we need to think about, and other dimensions, of course, thinking about it in relation to other genocides. I still think there's not enough done of that. It is very striking, we say never, when you think about I once did a sort of account of on the Google Ngram, where you look at the frequency of the phrase, of the way in which never again was gradually increasing in its usage. And obviously it comes in all sorts of contexts, but I'm assuming the increase also has to do with the Holocaust, at the same time as we had the killing fields in Cambodia, and then we had Rwanda, and we had Yugoslavia, and we're still saying never again, as though it weren't happening again. So I think keeping hold of it, but integrating in along different sort of axes of integration to make it meaningful. So going back to what Hank says, not losing sight of the small particulars, but also not trying to over-segment it so that it no longer connects with today. For me, this feels existential in ways that go beyond anything that I could sort of rationally legitimate, but I do think it's key. As for the future of what Jewish memory, I'm not going to speculate.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks also for the book plug. But I think that that question gets to a central point that I think we can really end on, because it's the way you framed the issue is so perceptive. But it's daunting to think about never again, and it's daunting to think about stopping genocide. And obviously that's not something that I feel I'm able to do. And I think most people on the Zoom call would also feel that they're not able to stop it. But what your book really powerfully does is show the little things that we can do to alleviate suffering, and to to reach out to other human beings and to bring them into a sense of community. And for that, I really thank you. And for the book, I thank you. And for this talk, I thank you. It's an important lesson. And thank you for leaving us with that lesson. I'll also, while I'm thanking, I'll thank Kelsey for having put this together, and for the staff of the Frankel Center. And unfortunately, we can't take you for dinner and have you chat with the guests right now. In a moment, I'm going to press the leave button and everybody's going to disappear poof as though they were never here. But really, it was a pleasure having you and a pleasure hearing from you. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure, Jeff. Thanks.
Thanks.